Good morning, all. We'll just give a little bit of a moment for cyberspace to let everybody in. Wonderful. Let's kick things off. Well, thank you for joining us for today's Women's Sport Trust webinar. I'm Tammy Parler, Chief Exec of the Women's Sport Trust, and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. For a number of years now, WST has been on a mission to increase the data available to the industry by providing consistent reporting on women's sport. This data has influenced strategies, provided evidence for pitches, and offered an essential benchmark and stimulus for growth. Women's sport is in a massive growth phase, and this summer hasn't disappointed. Here to present your findings this morning are Chris Hurst, a trustee of the Women's Sport Trust, who leads on our research, and he'll be joined by Emma Gibson and Shalina Nigam from Future Sport and Entertainment, who provide broadcast analysis to our report. Following the presentation, there'll be a couple of minutes and a chance to ask questions, so please list them in the chat. And you can also download the full report and these slides from the Women's Sport Trust website, and I'll post a link to that shortly. We'd also be really grateful if you could tell us what you think and how you're making use of this data. A short quote from you is absolute gold dust. It gives us insight, it motivates the heck out of us, and also, to be honest, it helps us secure the funding that enables us to keep sharing this data with you for free. You'll get an email through Eventbrite after this event, and if you could just take a moment to respond with, just a couple of sentences, your thoughts, what's useful, how this is helping you do your job, then we'd be incredibly grateful, and that would be a great support to us too. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Tammy, and good morning all. For those of you who haven't joined a Women's Sports Trust webinar before, just thought we would start by just explaining some of the definitions that we use for our deck. We split women's sport, mixed sport, and men's sport into 3 different categories. So women's sport covers things such as the Netball Super League or the WSL, so women's only competitions. Mixed sport are events like Wimbledon, where men's and women's competitions take place alongside each other. And then men's sport are things such as the Premier League. So into the findings so far in 2023 so far. Well, as we predicted, mainly because of the time zone in which the Women's World Cup took place, viewing in 2023 so far is actually down on the previous year, but still very positive, with over 34 million women's sports viewers so far in 2023. But what we see as one of the biggest changes so far is actually increased engagement from women's sports viewers. So the average viewing time per women's sports viewer so far this year has been 9 hours and 5 minutes, and that's up significantly from a previous best of 7 hours, 5 minutes at this point of the year in 2022. And we're also seeing that the engagement around women's sport in terms of the number of times that fans are coming on more than one occasion, it has remained actually fairly consistent with both 2022 and 2019. So again, we're seeing that prolonged habit of women's sports fans engaging on a regular basis with women's sport rather than coming just once or twice and not coming back. When it comes to total coverage hours so far this year, as ever, Sky Sports leads the way in terms of the coverage hours that it offers across its extensive range of channels for women's sport, with Sky Sports Mix, Sky Sports Arena, Sky Sports Cricket, Sky Sports Golf, and Sky Sports Main Event leading the way. And when it comes to viewing hours, there's actually been a fairly significant change. Normally we see BBC One dominating kind of this chart. Actually, thanks to their Women's World Cup coverage, it was ITV1 that leads the way so far this year in terms of viewing hours for women's sport. And a huge rise year on year, admittedly starting from a small base in terms of their viewing hours. It's also worth calling out, as women's sport looks to try to commercialize more effectively, just the success of Sky Sports in driving viewing hours. So Sky Sports Main Event viewing hours up 166% year on year, and Sky Sports Cricket viewing hours up 57% year on year. So really significant rises. When it comes to understanding what women's sports are dominating viewing hours, no surprises that football leads the way with 80% of total viewing hours so far, followed by cricket and rugby union. And when we compare where women's football stands against other sports, so men's football, tennis, and this includes both men's and women's tennis and men's cricket, women's football is really establishing itself as one of the most popular sporting properties in the UK, and that again is really interesting. To dive more deeply into the findings from the Women's World Cup, I'm now going to hand over to Emma.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so our first event-specific section of today is all about the FIFA Women's World Cup that, of course, took place this summer in Australia and New Zealand. And first of all, just to look at the really top-line linear TV audience metrics of this summer's tournament, comparing with previous Women's World Cups, but also comparing with previous Women's Euros. And then starting on the left-hand side, a look at coverage hours. You can see that the Women's World Cup this summer was the most covered global women's football tournament that we've ever seen, with that 165 coverage hours. And a big reason for that is actually the other number we've called out, that kind of grey line going across, and that's the game count, i.e. the number of games that actually were aired on linear TV. And you can see of the 64 games of the Women's World Cup this summer, 60 of them aired on linear TV across BBC and ITV. And if you compare that figure to the 2019 number, it's nearly double what we saw for the previous Women's World Cup back in 2019. So really just highlighting the breadth of coverage that then contributed to it being the most covered women's global football tournament that we've seen on record. And that was a big driver, if we move on to the middle chart, of the fact that the viewing hours for this year's tournament was the highest that we've ever seen for a global women's football tournament. So 194 million hours viewed, surpassing the previous high for previous World Cup back in 2019 in France. So a really impressive feat, given, as Chris mentioned, that the time difference and the fact that the tournament was held in Australia and New Zealand, of course, meant that there was the majority of the start times were less social in terms of viewing compared to France back in 2019 and the Women's Euros last year that was, of course, held in England. And then finally, on the right-hand side, a look at 3-minute unique reach. Just around 29 million people watched at least 3 minutes of the Women's World Cup, which is slightly down on what we saw for France in 2019 and also the Euros last year. And again, that's what we expected, given, as mentioned, that time difference and the kickoff times mainly being, well, some of them actually being through the night and being in the morning versus that kind of prime time slots that we saw for both 2019 and the Women's Euros last year. Switching to look at streaming just quickly, the BBC released figures on the total streams across BBC iPlayer and BBC Sport by previous global women's football tournaments. And what that showed was that a record 25.7 million total streams were viewed for the Women's World Cup this year, surpassing the previous high for the Women's Euros last year and also higher than previous Women's World Cup back in 2019. And actually what made that even more impressive was the game count. Just 33 games were streamed on BBC for this year's tournament, owing to the fact that the rights were split across both BBC and ITV. And that's quite a big drop from the 52 that we saw for France in 2019. So despite the fact that it was fewer games streamed, there were still those record numbers. So really just highlighting that across both linear TV and streaming, we've seen these records broken for the Women's World Cup, despite the fact that we had that kind of time difference to battle with. Switching back to linear TV now, again, the same metric that Chris mentioned earlier across all women's sport. We just looked at this average viewing time per viewer for global women's football tournaments. And you can see that around 6.75 hours on average were viewed by a Women's World Cup viewer this summer. And that's a marked increase on the previous highs that we saw around 5 hours for both the Euros last year and the Women's World Cup back in 2019. So it's again that combination of not only was the reach increasing for the Women's World Cup this year, but also the engagement rate and the amount of time that people were tuning in has also seen an increase. So it's that really positive combination of both. Moving on just to look at some of the demographics from the Women's World Cup this year. This is just looking at the proportion of female viewers for the tournament this summer versus previous global women's football tournaments. And again, we found a record here as well, in that 42% of all viewers were from this female audience group, surpassing or just slightly surpassing the previous high of 41% for the Women's Euros last summer. And we had a bit more of a look into this just to see if that was channel driven. As I mentioned earlier, the rights this year were split across both BBC and ITV, whereas for the Euros last year and actually the previous Women's World Cup as well, the rights were just with BBC. So Typically, viewing on ITV does skew a bit more female than BBC, so we checked if that was driving that increase, but actually the numbers were quite similar across both channels, so it wasn't really a factor here. It was just a general increase in share and interest in women's football from this particular group, which is of course very positive. And then another demographic we looked at was under 16 viewing, and very similar story in that we saw a peak in the share for this particular group for the Women's World Cup this summer compared to previous, so 7% up from kind of 6% that we saw for the Women's Euros last year. And a couple of reasons why that might be, one being the tournament took place within the summer holidays this year. And actually, I mentioned the less social start time for the Women's World Cup this year, given the time difference. Actually, for this particular group, it might have been a better start time, given it was games were starting kind of early morning and through to lunchtime versus kind of late evening for games happening or tournaments being held in Europe. So actually, for this particular group, the start time might have contributed to that boost in viewing. Moving on to look at specific average live audiences for games during the tournament. This is just looking at the average live audience for England games in the group stage, again, just for linear TV only. And we've just compared it to the previous two World Cups back in 2019 and 2015. And you can see, first of all, that the average audience for England's group games this summer is slightly lower than what we saw back in 2019. And again, that's what we'd expect given the start times and the time difference that took place, given that the tournament was held in Australia and New Zealand. And for each of the bars, we've just called out the start time, so you can kind of see that difference. So England games this summer started from between 8:30 and through to lunchtime, whereas for France back in 2019, it was very much within prime time viewing around 7:30 for two of the three group games. But actually then when we compare it back to 2015, which was held in Canada, we do see an increase in the average audience. And that's despite the fact that actually 2015 in Canada did have those prime time kickoff times, again, 5:30 to 8:30 kickoff times versus the morning for this summer. It really just helps to highlight that despite that time difference, there's been real growth in kind of these women's football audiences and interest in the last 8 years. And then same premise again, but looking at England's knockout games. It's a pretty similar story to the group games in that the numbers are slightly lower than what we saw in 2019, again, just because of those kick-up times being slightly less social for TV audience viewing, but equally still a boost on 2015, and kind of, again, showing that growth in the last 8 years. And just zoning in specifically quickly on the final against Spain, the average live audience was 8.3 million, which is actually slightly lower than what we saw for the semi-final against the US back in 2019. Again, just owing to the fact that kickoff time was in the morning. And then just for additional reference, the Women's Euros last year received an average audience of just over 11 million. So again, slightly higher than what we saw for the Spain final this year, but exactly what we expected, just given those differing kickoff times. And then going one step further, just to highlight the average live audience for all of the Women's World Cup matches this year, we've just called out in the table the average audience for both England games and non-England games by the different tournament stages. So you can see that around 500,000 average audience for non-England games this year, or around 450k. And that's about half of what we saw for non-England games back in 2019 at 1 million. So again, just owing to that time difference, especially a lot of the non-England games did take place very much through the night. And below that, we've just called out what the most watched non-England group game was. And a big driver of that was firstly the fact it aired on BBC One, and it also had a late morning kickoff time, which was the France v Brazil game, receiving an average audience of 1.2 million. Another reason it might have done well was actually it was quite an exciting game as well, with France getting a late winner to win that group game 2-1. Digging a bit deeper into women's football fans and then more broadly women's sport fans, previous research by the Women's Sport Trust alongside the RNA and Gemba has shown that currently in the UK there are 6 million committed women's sports fans, and that compares to 16 million committed men's sports fans. And that's defined by scoring 5 out of 5 on this claimed passion scale, and also watching at least 1 hour of content of that men's or women's sport a week. And of those 6 million committed women's sports fans, the research actually found that just 3% are only passionate about women's sport, i.e. have no interest or involvement in the men's sports side of things. And actually we performed for this research a similar type of analysis, but on the broadcast side of things, and the story was quite different. So this is looking at the linear TV viewer overlap between the men's and the women's FIFA World Cup for the previous 4 editions, so 2018 and 2019, and then 2022 and 2023. And what we found was that across both, there was this unique audience of viewers that are just watching the women's edition. So back in 2019, that was 9.9 million. And actually then saw an increase on the right-hand side for this summer's tournament, overlapped with the Men's World Cup at the back end of Qatar last year, going up to 11.5 million. Also worth noting at this point, we performed a similar analysis between the Men's World Cup in 2022 overlapped with the Women's Euros last year, and the unique Women's Euros figure for that was around 1.8 million. So that's quite a big jump now, going from that 1.8 million to 11.5 unique women's football viewers for the Women's World Cup. And we think there might be a few different reasons for that. One being, I've mentioned the rights being split for this tournament between ITV and BBC, which didn't happen for the Euros last year. So that varied coverage might have lent itself to more casual non-football fans tuning in and then being part of that 11.5 million group. Secondly, a potential out-of-home impact. The Euros last year was, of course, held in England, and as I've mentioned, the kickoff times were much more friendly to going out and watching it, either at the ground, given it was held here, or at various different venues like pubs, bars, etc. Whereas, again, because of the time difference, people were much more likely to have watched at home or even in the office at work for the World Cup this year, which again perhaps lended itself to more people being within that unique women's football group, making that 11.5 million as big a number as it is. We then dug a bit deeper into that unique women's football only group, just comparing with those people that watch both the men's and the women's World Cup. The first thing you can see here is that when we look at frequency of viewing, the grey bar, which is the people watching both the men's and the women's, are slightly more engaged or are tuning in more than what we see for just the women's group. So you can see when we look at the 5 to 10 number of occasions or 11 plus, that grey bar is slightly higher than the green bar, just basically saying that they're watching on more occasions than just the women's only group. However, when we compare 2019 to 2023, we do see some growth there. So the women's only group, again, that green bar, back in 2019, 8% of that group watched on 11 plus occasions. And then if we go to the right-hand side, actually for this summer, that figure goes up to 12%. So that gap in terms of frequency of viewing is narrowing between those two. And that unique women's football audience, in this case, is only becoming a more and more important group. Sticking with the Women's World Cup, but switching focus slightly, we also had a look at the share of ITV advertising by brand category during the Women's World Cup. Important to note at this point, this is just commercials, so it doesn't include the advert break bumpers that Zero held. And here we just looked at the split for that particular data point across England matches and non-England matches. And you can see that around a fifth or 20% of all advertising on ITV during England games during the tournament were from the cosmetics and personal care brand category. That figure goes down to 14% for non-England matches, but actually both of those figures are higher than what typically occurs on ITV during the morning, so 6% typically outside of the Women's World Cup. So really just highlighted that there was quite a clear targeting by this particular brand category to want to advertise during the Women's World Cup on ITV. And on the right-hand side, we've just called out the top 5 brands that had the most amount of advertising for both England and non-England games. And you can see there the likes of Shure and Gillette both coming from that cosmetics and personal care category. We then thought it was a good time just to highlight the high proportion of female viewing that we see on ITV, and especially in the morning. So the kind of green line that goes across the chart here, you can see that there's a peak, well, really a peak between 9 and 12 for that female viewing, hitting around 3/4 of the total. So really just to say that if advertisers at least aren't already, that should be a group that they're targeting for any adverts that they're placing on ITV1 in the morning. And back on the Women's World Cup advertising campaigns, we've just called out here a few that were specific to the Women's World Cup or the Lionesses. So Shure and Gillette I mentioned previously as being from that cosmetics and personal care category. And they both had campaigns and adverts involving Lionesses players. So Lauren James featured in the Shure advert, and Lottie Wubben-Moy featured in the Gillette Venus advert. And then similarly, or slightly different in that they didn't have any players involved, but another prominent brand during the tournament and their adverts was Weetabix. And no Lionesses players involved, but the entire campaign was all about supporting and getting behind the Lionesses. So it's really pleasing to see that a lot of the advertising during the tournament on ITV was specific to the Women's World Cup and all the Lionesses. And finally, on the advertising, we just wanted to benchmark the share of brand category for the Women's World Cup versus other programming on ITV. So the likes of the Men's FA Cup final as another sport example, Britain's Got Talent as a big entertainment programme example. And then this morning, given the fact that airs at the same time as when a lot of the Women's World Cup games took place. And actually what we found was that 15% of the total coming from the cosmetics and personal care category is quite a lot higher than what we see for these other programming. So it really just highlighted that there was a clear targeting here from brands within that group to really want to advertise during the Women's World Cup.
So we're now going to take a look at some of the digital highlights from the Women's World Cup. But before we do so, we thought it would be interesting just to dig a little bit more into the behaviours that we see on digital from women's sports fans. Something that you often hear is women's sports fans are more digital than men's sports fans because they need to go to digital to find out information that's not available through mainstream media. So in our recent research with the RNA, which was conducted by Gemba, we decided to put some of this to the test, and we thought some of the findings were really interesting and just showed the variance of behaviours and of men's and women's committed sports fans and where they seek their information. We found that 58% of committed men's sports fans go to mainstream media, news and websites to follow general sport or league information, but just 49% of committed women's sports fans do the same to follow women's sport. We then found that 14% of committed men's sports fans go to player social media channels to follow general sport or league information, yet 20% of committed women's sports fans use player social media channels as a source for this information. When it came to following player stories, 36% of committed men's sports fans go to mainstream media, news and websites to follow player stories, while just 32% of committed women's sports fans do the same. Yet 21% of committed men's sports fans go to player social media channels to follow player stories, but 28% of committed women's sports fans use player social media channels as a source for this information. So it just showed how sports fans are going to different sources for different information, and therefore the opportunity that exists to engage fans in different ways on these different platforms and channels. And then when it came to frequency of behaviour, again, we thought it'd be interesting to look at what do committed men's and women's sports fans do, and particularly those who are really committed, so accessing information on more than 5 occasions a day on different platforms. And what we found were committed men's sports fans' behaviour is just far more frequent, be that across social media, websites, talking about men's sports with friends or family, the use of apps or online fans communities and forums, than it is with women's sports fans at the moment. So that's a real opportunity for growth to build habit amongst women's sports fans, and some of that comes down to providing the content that committed women's sports fans want to be able to see and to also make it easily accessible. In the research that we published back in June, committed fans of women's sport told us that the content that they were most interested in were best shots, highlights packages, player skills, gameplay and tactical analysis, and then player personalities and stories. When we did an audit of the FIFA Women's World Cup TikTok account during the period of the tournament, it was really interesting to see that 39% of posts contain match footage, yet they accounted for 65% of views, just showing that, as the left-hand chart shows, just the real desire for fans to be able to watch the best of match action and celebrate the brilliant world-class skills of the elite athletes playing during that tournament. And then we thought it was interesting again to look at how BBC Sport covered the tournament and audience behaviour there. Again, huge audience interest in the period around the tournament on the BBC Sport website. So 22.6 million visitors to the BBC Sport website and app during the course of the tournament. We thought we'd compare audience behaviour around the 2015 semi-final with the 2023 semi-final. And again, what was interesting to us was while the match report figures remained relatively similar, so 1.3 million in 2015 to 1.5 million in 2023, there was a real variance in terms of behaviour over the course of the 8 years in terms of the number of people consuming the live text, but particularly those consuming kind of live clips, so 2.7 million live clips consumption versus 0.3 in 2015. It was also interesting for us in terms of the prominence that BBC Sport provided to women's sport on its website. So measuring the top 10 stories on the sports section each day. We found that 36% during this summer's tournament related to women's sport, which is slightly lower than in previous tournament periods, so the Women's Euros and the 2019 Women's World Cup. But this was the first of these 3 tournaments that took place that overlapped with the Men's Premier League. So shows some of the challenges that women's sport faces when it competes, particularly with the English Premier League being on. When it came to showcasing the best match action, FIFA managed to package the match footage in a way that was accessible to many of its different commercial partners, and these are just a small selection of the way in which it managed to deliver branded content packages for some of its commercial partners. So Hyundai had the rights for Goal of the Tournament, Zero had a Beautiful Moments content series, Kia ran a content series called Movement That Inspires, while Qatar Airways celebrated some of the best goals of the tournament for its Let It Fly series. Again, in the research that we published back in June, we found that committed women's sports fans want to access statistics and gameplay and tactical analysis, but often find it extremely difficult to do so in comparison to that similar type of material being available for men's fans. So again, it was great to see that Globant had a series called Behind the Play that offered tactical analysis of match footage, and Visa had a content series celebrating kind of the best player stats of the tournament. What was also encouraging about the Visa series was it wasn't just delivered via FIFA's channels, but also that they did a paid media campaign with Copper 90 to distribute that content across their channels as well. When it came to bringing to life some of the player personalities, particularly of the Lionesses, there were lots of different places that fans could go. Goal had a number of Lionesses star in its regular box-to-box series. BBC Sport had lots of challenge-based content on its channels, as did the Lionesses, who also provided a daily Lionesses Down Under show, which had lots of brilliant moments that could be clipped for social media. And then the England players themselves used their social channels to go behind the scenes and also showcase the team spirit that existed in the camp. And Mary Earps was a great example of doing that, particularly on her own TikTok channel. And it was a combination both of probably her social media account, but more probably her outstanding performances on the field of play that helped Mary Earps see the biggest post-tournament boost in awareness through the Futures Tracker. So a 14 percentage point increase in terms of awareness for her. And she was also, again, through Futures Tracker, listed by the majority of fans as their favourite Women's World Cup player kind of during the course of the tournament. Digital media also played a vital role in covering some of the big societal issues that came up during the course of the tournament. If you've not watched the Copper 90 video of their reporter accidentally meeting Mary Earps' parents on a train in Australia and going into the story of how they were the only England fans who were able to wear Mary Earps' England shirt during the tournament due to the lack of availability from Nike of those to buy, I'd highly encourage you to go and check out that video. And also channels played a vital role in telling the story of the Spanish FA, both covering issues related to the Spanish manager and also the Spanish FA president on their channels. And so, yeah, that was an important part of storytelling of the tournament as well. In our sponsorship research back in July, one of the recommendations that we made was not only for brands to invest in creating content around women's sport, but also investing in that paid media to make sure that that content was visible to fans. And there were lots of examples across the tournament, be it on Indovisa's channels, Nike's channels that provided regular updates on the tournament from a different perspective. And then in particular, the Google Pixel campaign with Goal that really made women's football content extremely visible on the platform. In fact, during the period of the Women's World Cup on the Gold TikTok channel, women's football related content actually had more views than men's content, although a shout out also to Copper 90 on their TikTok channel during the tournament, which actually had a higher proportion of posts dedicated to women's football than men's football during the course of the tournament as well. So that combination of commitment of publishers to covering the women's game was really important, but also brands investing in paid media to make that content visible was also really important, and something that we hope to continue to see, not just in football, but across all of women's sport. And then we looked again, just at one of the findings from our sponsorship research back in July, when we asked fans how should brands activate their women's sports sponsorships, the top answer was activations focused on community and grassroots. So it was, again, fascinating to see some of the storytelling around that. Nike ran 1,000 victories campaign on TikTok, which was a community-based story telling the tales of women from across the world and their grassroots football experiences, while Adidas pledged 1% of World Cup ball sales to promoting gender equality in the game. So again, a very different activation from a partner. So that's everything on the Women's World Cup for now. I'm now going to hand to Emma to look back on the Women's Ashes series. Thanks,
Chris. So yeah, on the Women's Ashes, starting with a few kind of headline stories from the series that took place earlier this summer. So 6.5 million people in the UK watched at least 3 minutes of the Women's Ashes, and that's across both the live and the BBC highlights that they have. And that's a marked increase on the 3.8 million that we saw for the previous Women's Ashes that took place in the UK back in 2019. Secondly, viewers on average watched for around 3 hours of coverage, and that's 131% higher than what we saw back for the 2019 Women's Ashes. So it's again that devastating combo that I talked about earlier with the Women's World Cup, where not only is the reach increasing, but actually the engagement that we're seeing with the property and the coverage also increased. And then finally, on the left-hand side, of that 6.5 million viewers, 37% of them had not actually watched any other women's sport in 2023 prior to the start of this Women's Ashes series. And that resulted in just under 2.5 million new viewers to women's sport as a result. So it really just highlighted that this property and this series had the ability to bring more people into this women's sport sphere in the UK that hadn't already watched any women's sport prior to it starting. And we had a bit of a look into who those new viewers are. And actually, quite interestingly, those viewers had a higher proportion of 16 to 34% and also ethnic minority group percentage than those viewers who were watching that had previously watched women's sport. So not only was this series able to bring in new viewers, but it was also bringing in viewers from very key target demographic groups. And then moving on to the right-hand side, we've really just tried to highlight how very much record-breaking this Women's Ashes series was. So this chart just shows the top 10 most watched women's bilateral days of cricket on Sky exclusively. And 6 out of the top 7 most watched of this particular group are from this 2023 Women's Ashes series, so across all formats as well. So really just highlighting that it wasn't just a particular day or particular match that drove the record viewing that we saw for this series, but actually consistently across formats and across the board, there was really, really strong interest in audiences for it. And this just breaks it down by format. Of course, it's a multi-format series, so there was a test and then a 3-match ODI series and then a 3-match IT20 series. And while all formats did see records broken and really strong audiences, on the left-hand side, it was actually the women's test that far exceeded any previous audiences that we've seen for that particular format. So 168,000 average audience for the live coverage, which is over double the previous high that we saw back in 2015 for that Women's Ashes test. Important to note there as well that this is the first time that it was a 5-day test, and it went the full 5 days, so really helped with the extended coverage and the hype around that particular game. And then in the middle, just moving on to the 3-match ODI series, this table here just looks at the top 5 most watched women's bilateral ODIs in the UK. And in that top 5, number 1, number 2, and number 3 are all from this Women's Ashes series. So again, just highlighting the really strong audiences that we saw on Sky for those live ODIs. And then finally, the last format, the IT20s, nothing number 1, but still some really strong kind of top 5 ranking in terms of the most watched women's international matches or most watched bilateral women's IT20s on Sky. So again, really just highlighting that across the board, there was these really strong audiences, not just confined to one particular day or match driving that growth. And in our previous research, we hypothesized about a potential scheduling impact on the Women's Ashes series, owing to the fact that the series this year took place fully within the same time frame as the 5 Test match men's Ashes series. And that was different to back in 2019, where the Women's Ashes took place before with no overlap. And then back in 2015, there was a bit of an overlap between the two. So we wanted to have a look at the audience impact of that and found that 48% of men's Ashes viewers watching live men's Ashes coverage also watched some women's Ashes coverage as well. And that equated to 3.64 million viewers watching both. And that 48% conversion rate is higher than what we've seen previously, 28% back in 2019, or slightly higher at 36% for 2015. So it really just helped to highlight to us that there was a potential impact there of, because of that schedule overlap, there was more potential men's cricket fans or viewers then going on to watch some of the women's Ashes because of this, the way it was scheduled. But we don't think it was just a scheduling impact. There was also the ECB's Ashes to Ashes campaign, and that co-marketed both the men's and the women's Ashes very much alongside each other. So that can only have helped drive that kind of viewer overlap between the two, given that they were, both the men's and the women's were kind of marketed side by side and put on that same pedestal. We also had a look at the share of viewing that came from both the men's and the women's Ashes. So if we add together the viewing in the UK for both of those, how much is coming from the women's Ashes? And this year we found that 10% came from women's Ashes coverage out of the two. And that's an increase, or actually double what we saw back in 2019 at 5%, and also higher than the 8% in 2015. So of course, there's lots more room to grow, but it's great to see that that percentage coming from the women's series is in fact growing. And finally, on cricket, we just had a quick look at, given the reach was so high for the women's Ashes, how many of those 6.5 million were perhaps new to cricket. So of that 6.5 million that watched the Women's Ashes series this year, 4.5 million of them actually hadn't watched any England women's coverage back in 2022. So suggesting that they are, in fact, new to watching at least international women's cricket. So we had a bit of a look into who those 4.5 million people are. And there was quite a clear split between the two. So 35%, or just over a third of them, had actually watched England men's cricket play last summer. So essentially suggesting that they're men's cricket fans that have been brought in and maybe hadn't watched any England women before, but whether it be as a result of the scheduling overlap or ECB's Ashes to Ashes campaign, they've then gone on to watch some women's cricket this year that perhaps they hadn't previously. And then the other group, around 65%, actually hadn't watched any England men or women's cricket in 2022 prior to them watching the Women's Ashes. So just highlighting that perhaps they maybe weren't previously cricket fans, but have been brought in to watch cricket, potentially for the first time from this coverage. So again, similar story to the Women's World Cup, where there's those kind of key two distinct groups in terms of existing fans that maybe previously had only watched the men's side, but also this other group where they're brought into a sport and to women's sport by having not watched any of the men's property. So yeah, really interesting to see how those groups kind of intersect, and something that we'll continue to look into.
So the next few slides are going to focus on the Netball World Cup, which took place earlier this summer. So to start, just looking at the 3-minute reach across the last 3 tournaments, and this year's was 5.6 million, which was just over 1 million higher than what we saw for the World Cup in 2019. But I think what's particularly pleasing to see is how much it's grown from 2015, which was just over 300,000. In terms of viewing hours, there was actually a bit of a decline on BBC and Sky Sports this year compared to last. But when you look on the right-hand side at the top, you can see that there was also a decline in coverage hours. So that kind of mirroring the other. But again, kind of comparing back to 2015, which was just on Sky and didn't have the BBC coverage, you can still see how much just even the Sky numbers themselves have grown in that period. And then flipping to the bottom of this chart and looking at the female demographic, and there's some particularly positive stats here. So in terms of these 3 tournaments, just over half were female viewers for the World Cup this year. And you can see that's a clear increase in what we were seeing even just in 2019, but particularly back in 2015. And then focusing on the final itself, which obviously England reached the final this summer, and looking at the female viewership only again. So the green line there is the viewer minute by minute for females only for the final this year compared to the grey in 2019. And obviously, firstly, you can see that it's very much higher for this year, which is great to see. But it was also kind of a sustained viewership, and it kind of steadily grew rather than kind of one quick peak, which we saw for 2019. And then in terms of netball coverage that's been on TV, we wanted to take a look at the journey amongst people watching netball. So starting on the left-hand side, we just have the cumulative average audience for the Netball Super League, which took place last year, the Jamaica series, which was on TV earlier this year in January, and then the Netball World Cup. So you can see there's kind of a clear increase in people watching netball across these different tournaments and leagues. And then on the right-hand side, we wanted to see, I guess, how that Jamaica series, which was on BBC in January, impacted viewers. So taking everybody that watched the Netball Super League last year, which was just under 500,000, and then taking everybody that watched the Jamaica series on BBC earlier this year. And the vast majority of those that watched the Jamaica series actually hadn't seen any of the Super League back in 2022. So 96% of them were brought into netball because of this coverage that was on BBC. And so that equated to 1.1 million viewers. And then taking that one step further, we wanted to see if those new viewers are now kind of continuing on and watching more netball. So overlap that with all viewers of the World Cup this past year. And it's really promising to see that almost half of those new viewers actually went on to watch the Netball World Cup as well. So they're not only brought into netball because of the BBC coverage, but they're actually interested in it and then watching more netball as well. And then finally on the World Cup, just looking at some demographics across the different tournaments and leagues of netball, but also women's sport as a whole. And the main takeaway here is that it does kind of vary a bit based on the tournament, but mostly based on the coverage. So Jamaica series was only on BBC, and the demographics for that skewed a bit older and more female, but slightly less upmarket. Whereas some of the other coverage here for netball is either on Sky or across both. And so you see slightly different skews there in terms of some of these demographics. And then switching to Wimbledon for a bit. So again, kind of a similar overview slide that Emma shared for the Women's World Cup earlier. But on the left-hand side, looking at coverage hours, you can see that 2023, in terms of linear TV, had the highest number of coverage hours for Wimbledon. And then that in turn translated to the highest number of viewing hours as well. So 271 million hours viewed, just slightly higher than what we saw for last year's edition. And then in terms of the reach, it's actually down slightly this year compared to what we'd seen previously. So fewer people being reached, but because viewing hours are up, people are watching for longer. And then in terms of Wimbledon, we wanted to look at the gender parity of things. So in terms of the schedule here, so how many games were scheduled on the two main courts. And it's really promising to see that it's actually very similar. So for the ladies across centre court and number one court, only one fewer game for both was scheduled than the gentlemen's. It's positive to see that Wimbledon's giving men and women the same stage there. And then taking a similar approach, but actually looking at the match count based on what was shown on TV, so splitting by BBC One and BBC Two, and then again by ladies and gentlemen's. It's a bit different for the TV coverage. So here there's a bit more of a discrepancy between how many men's and women's games are shown on those TV channels. And I guess the gap is a bit more split for BBC One, whereas when you look at BBC Two, there are only 4 fewer games shown for the ladies, so a bit more balance there. But once you get to the later stages of the tournament, it does balance out a bit more. So kind of quarterfinals onwards, it's a little more even. And then taking that quarterfinals onwards and looking at just the average audience itself, it's actually quite a positive story. So obviously just looking at the numbers, you can see that the women's is a bit lower than what the men's are receiving. But when you dig in a bit closer, it's actually increased in 2023 for the semi-finals average and the final audience for the women's. Whereas the men's is actually decreased there. So it's positive to see that more people are tuning in for the women's tournament as it gets later on than we were seeing in previous editions. And then finally, we can also look at gender parity in terms of the proportion of females watching. And again, this is a positive story for the women's in that the average audience coming from females for the finals only is a little bit higher than for the men's. So 56% on average of female viewers for the women's final compared to 53% for the men's, but across the board, Wimbledon kind of has a pretty good gender split in terms of viewers, and all of these over 50%. And then switching again slightly to look at a few other key events that happened this summer. So starting with the Women's Open. So on the left-hand side, we've just got the average audience by day split by the live coverage, which was on Sky, and then the highlights on BBC Two. And there's a converse relationship between the two. So in the earlier stages of the tournament, the live audiences were a little bit lower and then kind of steadily increased throughout until day 4. Whereas the highlights actually was the opposite. So started quite high on BBC and then got a bit lower as kind of people started watching more of the live content instead by day 4. And then on the bottom right, just highlighting the demographic difference. So both the Women's Open and the Men's Open have highlights on BBC. And while the female proportion is fairly similar for both, what's interesting to see is actually the change in the other demographics. So in terms of under 35s, 5% higher came from the women, so 15% of all viewers compared to 10 for the men's. But then the real difference comes from the ethnic minority group, where we've got 28% for the women's highlights compared to just 6% for the men's. So the women's highlights there bringing in a completely new audience that wouldn't have necessarily watched the men's highlights. And then looking at the Tour de France Femmes, on the left-hand side again, got the average live audience just by stage. So you can see kind of varies a little bit, but kind of relatively stable across those 8 days. And the average across those 8 stages were 38K. Comparing that to the men's Tour de France across all stages, that was 81K, so about half lower. But I guess the positive stat here is in that bottom circle where we looked at the overlap between the two. So how many people watched both the women's and the men's? And there were 346,000 people in total that watched any coverage of the women's, but 68% of those also watched the men's. So a really high overlap of people interested in both. And obviously this is a slightly newer tournament, so it's positive to see that there is an overlap there, and that people from the men's who are already fans or already watching could quite easily be brought in and watch the women's as well. And then finally, just looking at the Rugby League Challenge Cup. So again, got the audience on the left-hand side. And so this year's women's audience was a little bit lower than what we'd seen for the previous years, but it did conflict with England, Colombia in the Women's World Cup. So we'd probably expect the audience to be a bit lower. Perhaps if that clash hadn't happened, the audience might have been higher than we'd seen previously. But despite that, it's actually positive to see that the reach has gone up. And so it's reaching more people, but they just watch for slightly less time given the conflict with the England game. And then what was interesting for the Challenge Cup final this year is that the women's and the men's was held at Wembley on the same day for the first time. So again, kind of sticking with, in terms of the overlap, we wanted to look at, I guess, similar to the Ashes, whether there was a positive effect in terms of scheduling it kind of overlapping at the same time. So of the 3.2 million people who watched the men's final on BBC One, 13% also watched the women's final beforehand. And that 13% equates to 415,000 viewers that had watched some coverage of both. So obviously there's still room to grow there in terms of the numbers and the percentages, but when we compare that to what we saw for 2021 and 2022, those percentages have gone up. So that's positive to see there. And then finally, we wanted to take a look, I guess, taking a wider stance, not just on specific events, but kind of women's sport as a whole, and look at that journey and overlap as well. So starting with women's football, just looking at everybody that watched the Euros last summer, and kind of whether they went on to watch the Barclays Women's Super League season last year. And there was 10.5 million people that watched both of those tournaments. And then taking that further, we wanted to see if they then are still watching women's football and interested in the Women's World Cup that happened this summer. So of that 10.5 million, 85% also went on to watch the Women's World Cup. So there's a clear group of people that are very interested in women's football and watching all of the properties that are available. And I guess we kind of labeled those as a bit of an avid women's football fan. So we wanted to take that group and see kind of how do their viewing habits look, how engaged are they? So on this slide, we've just got number of occasions viewed for each of those 3 properties, split by this avid women's football fan, which is the green lines, and then just the average viewer of all of those properties, so the grey line there. And as you can see, for all 3 of these, the avid women's football fan is watching on more occasions. So they're not only watching all this content, but they're actually very engaged with it and watching for quite a lot. And it's really positive to see that for particularly those big global tournaments, almost like a third of people are watching 10 or more times. So really engaged, and there's kind of that core group of fans that are not only watching lots of content and lots of different content, but they're watching multiple times. And so that's a clear group that is very interested and, you know, can be taken one step further and targeted and marketed in a slightly different way than maybe the casual fan might be. And then in terms of viewer journey, we also wanted to look at the difference between free-to-air and pay TV. So obviously free-to-air is great for bringing in a lot of new viewers, but in terms of commercializing women's sport, we wanted to see whether those fans and those viewers are then going on to watch on pay TV as well. So on the left-hand side, we've got everybody that watched women's sport in 2022 on free-to-air, which was almost 40 million. and then taking everybody that watched last year on pay TV, which was just over 11 million, and then looking at that overlap. So how many people only watch women's sport on free to air, and that was 28.6 million. So quite a high proportion of that free to air viewership didn't watch on pay TV last year. So then taking that group that only watched on pay TV, that only watched on free to air, we wanted to see if they've then gone on to watch women's sport on pay TV in 2023. So looking on the right-hand side, we've taken that group of 28.6 million and overlapped it with all women's sport viewership on pay TV so far this year, which is 10.5 million. And then we found that there are 2 million people that didn't watch on women's sport on pay TV last year, but actually have watched this year. So that's a group of people that were brought into women's sport from free-to-air coverage last year, but have now since gone on to watch women's sport on pay TV this year. So kind of highlighting that they're becoming a bit more of a fan and they're willing to watch content behind a paywall. And so we then wanted to take that group and see what are they watching in women's sport, kind of what's interesting them. So firstly, we took the total viewing hours, and as you might guess, the vast majority is coming from the Barclays Women's Super League and then the Women's Ashes as well. But what was interesting to see from the rest of what they watched is it kind of split across a few different sports, but then also some non-live content as well. So that one that's in number 4 with 5% of total viewing hours is the Lionesses A League of Their Own special. So obviously still women's football and women's sport related, but not actually live content. So as that kind of becomes a bigger part of women's sport and a lot more non-live content and documentaries, etc., it's positive to see that that's actually having an impact as well in terms of bringing people into women's sport. And then they watched again on quite a few occasions. So comparing that group to just the average women's sport viewer this year, again, they're a bit more engaged and kind of watching for more occasions. So as you can see, over half of this group have watched on more than 4 occasions, and that's a bit higher than what we saw for the average viewer. And then in terms of who they are and their demographics, in terms of female proportions, it's fairly similar to the average viewer. But for under 35s, you can see there's a difference there. So they're a bit younger, with almost a third being under the age of 35. And then a little over a third having children in households, which is again a bit higher than what we saw for the average viewer. And I'll hand back to Chris just to wrap up everything that we've gone through.
Yeah, so we realised in the last 50 minutes, we've gone through a lot of information, a lot of data. There are some summaries available of what we've presented on our social channels, particularly on LinkedIn and X. So be really grateful if you can share those posts with your networks and encourage friends, colleagues, contacts to download that information. But in terms of wrapping up today's webinar, just 6 key takeaways for you all. We saw the highest minutes viewed from January to August for women's sport in 2023 on linear TV, with a 28% increase in minutes viewed per person from 2022. 7% of the Women's World Cup 2023 linear TV audiences were under the age of 16. That's higher than previous women's football tournaments. 5.6 million people reached during the Netball World Cup on linear TV. That's 1.1 million higher than the 2019 edition. 37% of women's Ashes viewers on linear TV had not watched any other women's sport in 2023. So that's 2.4 million new viewers. 11.5 million watched the Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand, but didn't watch any of the men's tournament in Qatar on linear TV. That's 39% of the total Women's World Cup 2023 audience. And of the viewers that watched women's sport in 2022 only on free-to-air channels, 2 million have gone on to watch on pay TV in 2023 across linear TV. That's everything from us in terms of presentation. I'm going to hand back to Tammy now. Thank you. And Tammy, you're on mute, so we can't hear you.
And I was saying such interesting things as well, Chris. I was saying how grateful I was to you, Chris, to Emma and Shalina for all the hard work. I mean, what a report. There is so much information in here. I am struck also by the questions that we've been getting. Each time we seem to go to a different level of depth with those questions, and I really wish we could answer them all. The thing that I find so encouraging is that we're not talking anymore about can we get on television, but for instance, there was Laura who asked, about some correlation between content production quality and viewing numbers and things. So we're getting to that depth of questioning now with women's sport, which I just think is fantastic. We haven't got a lot of time left, so just a few quick questions that I'm going to pick out. Emma and Shalina, this is another peak moment for women's sport with the FIFA Women's World Cup. Given what you've analysed before in the Euros and so forth, will this interest trickle down domestically? What's your predictions to that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. Previous research, off the back of the Euros, we did see that last year the Women's Super League did see an increase in audiences. That's not to say that was wholly down to the Euros, but there's definitely some impact there. And equally seen it with other sports when we talked about the Rugby World Cup last year and almost piggybacking onto that. So I think what we'd say is we wouldn't expect this to then mean a kind of skyrocket in domestic women's football audiences. But if it is that kind of steady growth that we did see last year off the back of the Euros, that's still a really positive thing. Every year can't be this kind of 2 times, 3 times for perhaps domestic football. But if we can just continue that growth at a steady rate, and the Women's World Cup this summer helps with that, I think that's only a good thing.
Fantastic. Chris, if I could come to you, there was lots of questions around the fandom, sort of the content and so forth, and it's a really interesting one to how fans have demonstrated their fandom, the importance of athlete and social channels. Someone said, do you think social platforms are picking up the slack of the official networks? I don't think that's the case. I think the networks are just trying to figure it out and trying to understand what content people want. Do you think, or is it? I mean, is it distinct, or is it about availability? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the social platforms themselves are the platforms in which many of those media publishers and broadcasters publish their social content as well. So I think it's also recognising that the likes of BBC, Sky, ITV are major contributors to providing content on social media around women's sport, aside from all the work that they do in terms of TV broadcast. In terms of the changing and evolving needs of women's sports fans, be they those fans who, in our research we published in June, are committed fans, so coming week in, week out to consume content, versus those fans that we showed have come in huge numbers just to watch the Women's World Cup. I think we're still learning about the differences in behaviours, and shows some of the complexities that face rights holders, brands and broadcasters. And it's not a one-size-fits-all women's sports fan. You need to have different strategies to engage with different groups in different ways. And it's not about necessarily, if your budgets afford, focusing on one group or another, but it's about trying to build different fan segments and cater for them in different ways. I think what our research shows is there's still, despite all the brilliant progress that's been made, like incredible room for growth. And so that's the thing that I think is really exciting. And yeah, as you said, Tammy, the fact that people are beginning to think in really sophisticated ways about both the questions they need to ask, but also using the research from the likes of us, but also their own research, like actually the solutions to better serving women's sports fans, like that's also a really interesting area to watch in the coming years too.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just seen the time, and unfortunately that's, I think, all we've got time for this morning. So please encourage your colleagues to head to the Women's Sport Trust website to download a copy of the report. And please don't forget to let us know what you think. Your comments, your how you're using the research is incredibly helpful to us to be able to continue delivering this to you, and to understand more about what's driving women's sport forward. So massive thanks to you all for joining us, and to Chris and to Emma and Shalina for their contributions. Have a great morning.